The morning they traded Catherine Yates like a brood mare at auction, the sun had the audacity to rise beautiful over the Arizona territory, painting the sky in shades of peach and gold, as though the world had no idea it was about to break a young woman's heart clean in two. She stood in the yard of her father's ranch, the dust still cool beneath her boots, watching the riders come up the long road from the south. She had known they were coming. Her father, Earl Yates, had told her 3 nights prior, sitting across the dinner table with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed somewhere on the floorboards, somewhere that was definitely not her face. "There's going to be an arrangement," he had said, those 4 words carrying the weight of a coffin. Her mother, God rest her soul, had been gone 6 years. There was no one to argue against Earl Yates when he had made up his mind, and Catherine had learned young that making up his mind was the one thing Earl Yates was genuinely good at. Everything else, the ranch, the cattle, the debts he accumulated like a man collecting river stones, those things had a way of slipping through his fingers. The feud between the Yates family and the Harlan family had started before Catherine was born, over a waterway that both families claimed ran through their land. In the dry heat of Cochise County, Arizona, in the year 1882, water was not a small thing. Water was everything. It was the difference between grass and dust, between living cattle and dead ones, between a working ranch and a plot of rocky earth you couldn't give away. For 20 years, the two families had traded insults, threats, and occasional gunfire across that creek. 2 men had died. Fences had been cut. Horses had been turned loose in the night. The hatred between Earl Yates and Silas Harlan had become something almost mythological in the county, the kind of feud that people talked about in saloons and general stores as though it were a natural feature of the landscape, like the mountains. But Silas Harlan had a son. His name was Wade Harlan, and he was 28 years old with hard eyes and a jaw like a fence post, and he wanted a wife. Earl Yates had a daughter. Catherine, 22 years old with dark hair and green eyes and a stubbornness that had caused her father more grief than the creek dispute ever had. And Earl Yates had debts, bad ones, the kind that came with threats attached. The arrangement had been brokered by a man named Doyle Pratt, who served as a kind of unofficial mediator in the county whenever 2 families needed to stop shooting at each other long enough to talk money. Doyle Pratt had ridden back and forth between the 2 ranches for the better part of a week, and what he had eventually brokered was this: Catherine Yates would marry Wade Harlan. In exchange, the Harlan family would recognize the Yates family's right to the creek, and Silas Harlan would quietly make Earl Yates' most pressing debt owed to a man in Tucson who had already sent 2 unpleasant visitors disappear. Nobody had asked Catherine. She had found out the way she found out most things in her father's house, by standing very still in the hallway while the men talked in the sitting room, her back pressed against the wall and her breath held shallow. She had heard every word. And when the riders had gone and her father had come out of that room looking lighter than he had in years, she had stepped out of the shadows and looked at him with those green eyes of hers. "Catherine," he had said. "Don't," she had replied. She had gone to her room, and she had pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, and she had cried for about 10 minutes, which was all the time she believed crying deserved. Then she had straightened up, splashed water on her face from the basin, and begun thinking about what, if anything, she could do. The answer had come back to her again and again over 3 days of thinking. Nothing. She could do nothing. She had no money of her own. She had nowhere to go. The nearest town of any size was Bisbee, 12 miles away, and she knew perhaps 3 people there, none of them well enough to take in a woman fleeing her father's arrangements. Running would only make things worse. Earl Yates would send men after her, and Silas Harlan would interpret it as the Yates family breaking the agreement, and the whole fragile peace would collapse before it had even properly begun. So she had stood in the yard that morning and watched the riders come. There were 4 of them. Silas Harlan rode in front, a wide man with a white beard and the bearing of a man who had spent 50 years being obeyed. Beside him rode his son Wade, who looked at Catherine the way, A man looks at a piece of land he is calculating the value of. Behind them rode two hands from the Harlan outfit, there to make the occasion look official. Earl Yates walked out from the porch to meet them. The conversation that followed lasted less than 15 minutes. There was the matter of the documents, a paper that represented the deed to the water rights, which Silas Harlan signed and passed to Earl Yates with the ceremony of a man completing a business transaction. There was the matter of the debt, which Silas confirmed would be handled by the end of the week. There was a handshake, the kind that meant everything in Cochise County in 1882. And then Silas Harlan looked at Catherine and said, "You'll ride with us, girl." Catherine looked at her father. Earl Yates looked at the ground. She had one saddlebag packed. She had known better than to bring more. She mounted her horse, a pale roan mare she had raised from a foal and named Pearl, and she rode between the Harlan men out through the gate of the only home she had ever known, and she did not look back. Looking back was the one luxury she refused herself. The Harlan ranch was larger than the Yates spread, and it showed. The main house was solid adobe with a proper porch and glass windows, and the outbuildings were well-maintained and numerous. Silas Harlan had built something real out here, whatever else you could say about him. Catherine catalogued it all with the detached efficiency of a woman taking inventory, because cataloging kept her from feeling. She was given a room of her own in the main house, and a woman named Rosa who cooked and kept the house was told to see to her needs. Wade Harlan had been formal and distant on the ride over, which she had appreciated. He had not touched her, had not spoken much, and when he helped her down from Pearl at the ranch, he had done so briefly and stepped back. That first evening, Silas Harlan sat her down at the dinner table and explained the situation with the directness of a man who had not acquired the habit of softening things. "The wedding will be in 3 weeks," he said. "Reverend Caulfield from Bisbee will come out and do it proper. You'll be Wade's wife and you'll be treated as such in this house. You have any questions?" Catherine had folded her hands in her lap and looked across the table at Wade, who was eating his beans with his eyes on his plate. "Does your son have any questions?" she asked. Silas had looked at her with something that might have been surprise, and for just a moment something that might have been respect. "He knows what he signed on for," Silas said. Wade had not looked up from his beans. That night, alone in the unfamiliar room, Catherine allowed herself to cry for exactly 10 more minutes. Then she lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and told herself that she was going to figure this out. She did not know what figuring it out meant, exactly. She just knew she had to hold onto the idea of it the way a drowning woman holds onto a rope. The next 2 weeks passed in a kind of suspended unreality. Catherine learned the rhythms of the Harlan household, helped Rosa in the kitchen, and rode Pearl in the mornings along the creek that had started all of this, watching the water move over the stones and thinking about how something so simple could ruin so many lives. She and Wade ate dinner together most evenings. He was not cruel. He was not warm either. He was a man who had agreed to a transaction and was going through with it because his father had decided it was time for him to have a wife, and objecting to his father's decisions was apparently not something Wade Harlan did. She found herself wondering sometimes whether Wade was as unhappy about this as she was. There were moments when he looked at her from across the table with an expression she could not quite read, not desire, not quite, but something more complicated. Something that might have been longing if you stretched the definition, or regret. She did not ask him. Some conversations had too many sharp edges. On a Wednesday morning, 11 days before the scheduled wedding, everything changed. She was out by the creek with Pearl, having ridden down to the water to let the horse drink when she heard riders. Not the Harlan hands, she had learned the sounds of those men, their voices and the particular gait of their horses, but strangers. She pulled Pearl back from the water and stayed in the shadow of the cottonwood trees, watching. 3 men came along the near bank of the creek. They were dusty and travel-worn, and the man in the lead was riding a tall black horse with a white blaze on its nose. He was tall himself, with broad shoulders and the kind of face that a woman notices not because it is conventionally handsome, but because it is interesting, angular, and weathered and alive in some way that suggested the man behind it was paying attention to the world around him. He wore a dark hat pulled low and a brown canvas coat, and he rode easy, the way men who have spent most of their lives in the saddle ride, as though the horse and the man were one continuous piece of the landscape. The two men with him she paid less attention to. They were older, ranch hand types, clearly working for whoever the first man was. She might have stayed hidden and let them pass, but Pearl chose that moment to shift and step on a dry branch, and the crack of it was sharp in the morning air. The man on the black horse turned his head, and his eyes found her in the shade of the cottonwoods with a directness that suggested he was not a man who missed much. He touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am. Didn't mean to startle you." "You didn't," she said, which was almost true. He looked at her for a moment with those attentive eyes, and then he looked at the creek, and then he looked back at her. "We're riding through to Bisbee, cutting across to save time. This land belonged to the Harlans." "It does now," she said, and she was not sure why she said it that way with that emphasis except that it felt accurate. Something in his expression shifted just slightly. "You all right, ma'am?" "I'm fine," she said, which was less almost true and more simply what you said. He studied her for another moment, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being seen clearly by someone who had no business seeing her at all. Then he nodded, touched his hat again, and the three riders moved on along the bank. She sat with Pearl for a long time after they had gone, her heart doing something irregular she could not entirely explain. She did not expect to see him again. She was wrong. The following Saturday, Silas Harlan drove her and Wade into Bisbee in the wagon to visit the dry goods store and make some arrangements for the wedding. It was a bright day, the kind of day that made the Arizona territory look almost benevolent, all blue sky and pale rock, and the faint smell of desert sage. Bisbee was a mining town, growing fast and a little rough at the edges, with a main street that was already busy by the time they arrived. While Silas talked to the reverend in the church, Wade took her to the dry goods store, where she was supposed to look at fabric for a dress she had absolutely no enthusiasm for. She was standing at the counter running her fingers over a bolt of white muslin, pretending to consider it, when she became aware of a presence beside her. "That's a decent fabric," said a familiar voice, "though I always thought blue suited this part of the country better than white." She turned, and there he was, the man from the creek, now without the trail dust, wearing a clean shirt and his dark hat, looking at the bolts of fabric with what appeared to be genuine consideration. She blinked. "You." He turned, and the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the suggestion of one. "Me, Frederick Ford." He extended his hand, not reaching for hers to kiss it but offering it straight out, the way you'd offer it to another man. She shook it before she'd consciously decided to. "Catherine Yates," she said. "The Harlan Ranch," he said, and she saw the recognition cross his face. "You're the Yates girl." "I am still Catherine," she said, with a precision that made him pause. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth moved more decisively. "You are." He held her gaze a moment too long for a stranger, and she looked away because looking at him made her feel off balance in a way she was not equipped to deal with at present. "What brings you to Bisbee, Mr. Ford?" "Business," he said. "I run a small cattle operation about 20 miles northeast up near the Dragoon foothills. Came in to settle accounts with a man here and pick up some supplies." He paused. "And you?" "Wedding preparations," she said. The words tasted like ash. His expression shifted again, that almost imperceptible change she was beginning to recognize. He looked at her hands, her left hand specifically, where there was no ring, and then back at her face. "Yours." "Mine," she confirmed. A beat of silence. "Congratulations." She looked at the white muslin. "Thank you." He did not leave immediately. He seemed to be turning something over in his mind. Then he said quietly, because Wade had moved to the other end of the counter and was talking to the store owner, "You don't look like a woman making happy preparations." It was such a direct observation, so simply stated, that it knocked the breath out of her for just a moment. She pressed her lips together and considered her options. She could deflect. She was good at deflecting. She had practiced it her whole life. Instead, she said, "No, I don't suppose I do." He watched her for a moment, and whatever he saw in her face, whatever it was that he was so apparently good at reading, he did not press further. He just said, "If you ever need anything, Miss Catherine, the Ford place is 20 miles northeast. Anybody around here can tell you how to find it." And then he tipped his hat and walked toward the back of the store, and she watched him go with a feeling that was part confusion, and part something she could not name, and part a grief she would not examine. On the ride back to the Harlan ranch, she sat in the back of the wagon and watched the desert pass and thought about Frederick Ford, which was probably not the most sensible thing she could be doing 11 days before her wedding to another man. But then, she thought, she had not been given many options for sensible lately. 6 days before the wedding, the trouble between the two families erupted again. It started, as so many things started in Cochise County, over something that seemed small until it caught fire. One of the Harlan cattle hands found a stretch of cut fence on the south pasture, and 3 of the Harlan's best breeding cattle had wandered onto what had been Yates' land before the agreement. One of them had broken a leg in a dry wash and had to be put down. Silas Harlan's temper, which Catherine had been cautiously getting a sense of over the past 2 weeks, was considerable when it arrived. He rode out to the Yates ranch himself, with Wade in 2 hands, and the conversation with Earl Yates had apparently not gone well. Earl Yates, confronted with the accusation that his remaining hand had cut the fence on purpose, had denied it loudly and with considerable profanity, and the fragile piece that had been purchased at Catherine's expense had developed a dangerous crack. She learned all of this from Rosa, who learned it from one of the hands who had been there. That evening at dinner the house was taut with tension. Silas ate in silence. Wade ate in silence. Catherine ate in silence and watched the two of them and thought about what happened to a trading piece when the trade went bad. "If this comes apart," she said finally, because the silence had become intolerable, "what happens to me?" Silas looked up. Wade looked up. "It won't come apart," Silas said. "But if it did," she said. Silas set down his fork. He looked at her for a long moment and she held his gaze because flinching served no one. "The agreement stands on both sides," he said finally. "You're here, that's done." "I am here," she agreed. "I would like to know what that means if the rest of it falls through." It was Wade who spoke and she was surprised by it. He had been so quiet for 2 weeks that she had almost forgotten he had opinions. "It means you're still in this house," he said. "It means the wedding still happens. The two things aren't connected." She looked at him. They were entirely connected when they were arranged. He met her eyes, and there was something in his expression she had not expected, something uncomfortable, like a man who knows he is in the wrong but has not yet decided what to do about it. "I know that," he said quietly. She put her fork down. "Then you understand why I'm asking." A long silence. "I'll talk to my father," Wade said. He looked at Silas. Silas made a sound in his throat that was not quite agreement and not quite refusal, and the dinner ended shortly after. That night she lay awake for a long time. She was thinking about what Wade had said, "I'll talk to my father," and what it meant that he had said it, and what it meant that Silas had not immediately overridden him. She was thinking about the word arranged, and how it described both a marriage and a transaction, and how those two things were not supposed to be the same. She was thinking about Frederick Ford, which she had been doing with uncomfortable regularity, and the way he had said "me." Frederick Ford, so simply, as though he were just a man and not a development she had not anticipated. She was thinking about the 20 miles northeast and the Dragoon foothills, and how far that was and how far was far enough. 3 days before the wedding, the situation between the families deteriorated further. Earl Yates, who could apparently not leave well enough alone, even when well enough was the only thing standing between him and serious trouble, had sent a letter to Silas Harlan accusing the Harlan hands of diverting water from the creek on the North Branch, where it ran through what had been the boundary of the old dispute. The letter was not diplomatic. It was, by all accounts, several pages of aggressive accusations, many of which were probably not accurate, and all of which were delivered in Earl Yates' particular style of self-righteous grievance that Catherine had grown up watching him deploy against everyone from neighbors to shopkeepers. Silas Harlan, upon receiving this letter, did two things. First, he sent one of his hands to the Yates ranch with a response that was even less diplomatic. Second, he told Wade to go to Bisbee and fetch Doyle Pratt, the mediator, because if this didn't get handled before the weekend, they were going to be back where they started. Wade left on Thursday morning. He was gone by the time the real trouble started. It came in the form of two men arriving at the Harlan ranch in the late afternoon, riding hard from the direction of the Yates spread. They were not Harlan men, and they were not exactly Yates men either. They were the kind of men who appeared in between disputes, men who hired their services to whoever was currently most agitated, which was apparently now Earl Yates. Rosa came to find Catherine in the garden where she had been sitting on a bench and trying to read a book and failing. The cook's face was tight. "There are men at the front gate," Rosa said, low and quick. "They came from your father's ranch, Mr. Harlan is talking to them now, but Miss Catherine, they don't look like they came to talk." Catherine stood up, the book forgotten. She walked to the side of the house where she could see the front gate without being seen herself, and she assessed the situation the way she had learned to assess most things in her life, quickly and without the comfort of illusions. The two men were indeed not there to talk. She could see it in the set of their shoulders, the way their hands stayed close to their guns, the particular energy of men who had been paid to deliver a message that went beyond words. Silas was standing in his yard talking to them with the confidence of a man on his own land, but he was outnumbered, and his nearest hand was 50 yards away by the barn. What happened next was not planned. She did not sit down and consider her options and make a rational decision. She simply turned from the house, walked to the barn, saddled Pearl with hands that were steady because she needed them to be, and rode out the back way, keeping the buildings between her and the front gate, moving at a walk until she was behind the hill and then letting Pearl run. She rode northeast. She had no conscious plan. She had an instinct, which pointed her toward the Dragoon foothills, 20 miles away, and a voice in her head that sounded disturbingly like Frederick Ford saying, "If you ever need anything." Pearl was fast when she wanted to be, and she wanted to be now, reading Catherine's urgency the way a good horse reads a rider. The afternoon light was long and golden, the desert opening out on either side as she left the Harlan land behind, and Catherine rode with her hair coming loose from its pins and the wind in her face, and something that was almost terrifying because it felt, for the first time in weeks, like freedom. She reached the Ford place as the sun was dropping behind the Dragoons, painting the whole western sky in shades of copper and blood orange. It was a working ranch, modest but well kept, with a good-sized house and a bunkhouse and a barn and fenced pastures where cattle moved in the dusk. She could see light in the windows of the main house. She slowed Pearl to a walk at the gate, suddenly and completely aware of the absurdity of her position. She was a woman who had ridden 20 miles across the Arizona desert on the strength of 4 words spoken by a near stranger. She had no particular right to be here. She had no claim on this man's hospitality or his time or his attention. She dismounted, opened the gate, led Pearl through, and walked up to the porch. She knocked on the door. She heard footsteps inside, and then the door opened, and Frederick Ford stood in the lamplight looking at her with those attentive eyes, and she saw the sequence of reactions cross his face: surprise, recognition, concern, a question he did not ask immediately. He looked past her at Pearl, at the 20 miles of desert she had just crossed, at the state of her hair and the dust on her dress, and then he looked at her face. "Come in," he said simply. That was all. Not what happened, not what are you doing here, not any of the dozen questions he had every right to ask. Just come in, as though a woman appearing on his porch at dusk having ridden halfway across the territory was an occasion requiring only hospitality. She sat at his table, a solid wooden table, well used, with 2 chairs and a lamp burning in the center, and he poured her water from a pitcher and set a cup of cold coffee in front of her, and she drank the water and he sat across from her and waited. She told him everything. She was not sure afterward why she had told him everything. She had spent her whole life being careful about what she revealed to people, because information given to people was information they could use against you, and Earl Yates' house had been a good place to learn that lesson. But she sat at Frederick Ford's table in the Dragoon foothills, and she told him about the creek and the feud and the 20 years of hatred, and the debts and Doyle Pratt going back and forth between the ranches and the dinner, where her father had said there's going to be an arrangement, and about standing in the yard that morning 3 weeks ago watching the riders come, and about Wade Harlan who was not cruel but was not warm, and about the 2 men at the gate this afternoon and Rose's face, and the decision she had not consciously made, but had made nonetheless. Frederick Ford listened to all of it without interrupting. He was very still while she talked, the way careful men are still, not passive but attentive. He drank his coffee and he watched her face and he listened. When she finished, there was a silence. Then he said, "You know this doesn't solve anything. Your father's still going to owe that debt. The Harlans are still going to be angry. None of that goes away because you rode out." "I know that," she said, "and you still came." "I still came," she agreed. He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you want, Catherine?" The use of her name, just her name without the miss or the ma'am, startled her. She looked at him. "I want to not be a piece moved around a board by men who find it convenient to use me," she said, and the plainness of it surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him, because those words had been inside her for weeks and she had not known until this moment how ready they were to come out. Something happened in his expression. Something quieted. He set down his cup and he said, "All right." He gave her the use of the spare room, which was small and clean, and had a window that looked east toward nothing in particular. He told her that she was welcome to stay as long as she needed, and that he would sleep in the bunkhouse with his 2 hands. There was a man named Amos and a man named Burl, both older and taciturn in the comfortable way of experienced ranch hands, and that tomorrow they would figure out what came next. She slept more deeply than she had slept in 3 weeks. In the morning she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and she washed her face in the basin and braided her hair, and came out to find Frederick Ford at the stove with his sleeves rolled to the elbows and his hat on the peg by the door, cooking breakfast with the practiced ease of a man who had been feeding himself for some time. He handed her a plate and sat across from her and they ate together in a silence that was, she noticed, a completely different kind of silence than the one she had shared with Wade Harlan over 2 weeks of dinners. That silence had been the silence of 2 strangers who had nothing to say to each other. This was the silence of 2 people who were still figuring out all the things they had to say. "Tell me about your cattle operation," she said, because she was curious and because it seemed like a reasonable place to start. He told her. He had come to Arizona 4 years ago from Texas. He explained, with a modest amount of money from selling a family property and a clear-eyed sense that the Cochise County range was good country for a man willing to work it properly. He had built the house himself, him and Amos and Burl, and he had started with 60 head and was now running close to 200. Selling to the Army contract out of Fort Huachuca, and occasionally to the Bisbee mining operations that needed beef for their crews. He told her about the country around the Dragoons, the way it changed in the summer rains, the way the mountains looked at dawn. He talked about it the way people talk about places they have genuinely learned to love, with specificity and affection, noting the particular juniper on the East Ridge, and the way the creek in the north pasture ran clear even in dry years. She listened, and she felt with an almost uncomfortable clarity that she was listening to a man describe a life, a real one built by his own choices, rooted in something he had made rather than inherited. "You're not from here originally," she said. "How did you know you wanted to stay?" He considered this with the seriousness she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. He thought before he spoke, which was not as common as it should have been. "I didn't for the first year," he said. "I missed Texas. I thought I'd made a mistake. Then one morning I was out on the east pasture and the sun came up over the dragoons and the whole sky went this color I don't know how to describe, not red, not orange, something in between, and I thought, all right, this is where I am. This is where I'll be." She looked at him across the table in the morning light. He was 30 years old, she had learned. He had mentioned it in passing, some reference to having spent his 20s building rather than wandering. 30, with those attentive eyes and that quality of stillness that she found increasingly difficult to look away from. "What happens to the woman?" she asked. "Not any particular woman. The woman, her." He met her eyes. "What do you want to happen?" "I told you last night. I want to not be moved around a board." "Then stop being a piece on the board," he said. And it was so simple and so impossible and so obvious that she laughed, which surprised both of them, because she had not laughed in 3 weeks, and the sound of it was slightly startling, like a bird calling in a room. He smiled at that. A full one this time, not a suggestion but the real thing, and it changed his face entirely, made it younger, warmer, more open. She felt it like a hand reaching through her chest and squeezing something essential. She looked away quickly. She stayed 4 days. They were, she would think later, 4 of the most significant days of her life, though they were mostly ordinary. She helped with the cooking, which she was competent at, and she helped with some of the lighter work around the ranch, mending fences, sorting seed, the endless small tasks of a working operation. She rode Pearl in the mornings across the Dragoon Range, and sometimes Frederick Ford rode out with her on his black horse, whose name, she learned, was Conquest, which she found amusing. "That's a large name for a horse," she said on the second morning. "He has a large opinion of himself," Frederick said. It seemed to suit. She laughed again. It was getting easier. They talked in the evenings, sitting on the porch with the last of the day's light, and she learned pieces of him the way you learn pieces of a landscape, one feature at a time, each one suggesting something larger. He had grown up on a cattle ranch in the hill country of Texas, his father a working rancher, his mother a schoolteacher from Virginia who had come west and found, to her own surprise, that she loved it. He had 2 brothers, both still in Texas, both married with children. He had gone to school for 2 years in San Antonio and come back, convinced that he wanted to be outdoors, working something with his hands, building something that was his. He asked about her too, and she answered, because something about the way he asked made dishonesty feel wasteful. She told him about growing up on the Yates ranch, about her mother who had been a warm and practical woman with a great deal of common sense and very little luck, having married Earl Yates. About the books she had read, the ones her mother had collected and left behind, Dickens and George Eliot, and secretly some of the dime novels that made everything in the West seem more romantic and straightforward than it actually was. "Have you read George Eliot?" she asked him, genuinely curious. "Middlemarch," he said, and she stared at him. "You have," she said. "Mother sent it," he said, with the mild dignity of a man who is entirely comfortable with himself. "I read it twice." She stared at him a little longer than was strictly polite. On the evening of the 3rd day, Amos came to the porch and told Frederick that a rider had come to the gate asking if anyone had seen a woman matching Catherine's description. The rider was from the Harlan Ranch. Frederick looked at Catherine. She looked back at him. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. She thought about it. She thought about the wedding that had been 3 days away when she left, which meant it was now supposed to be happening tomorrow. She thought about Wade Harlan, who was not cruel but was not warm, who had said, "I'll talk to my father," who was probably right now somewhere between Bisbee and his family's ranch with Doyle Pratt in tow, trying to fix a situation that was rapidly coming apart. She thought about her father, Earl Yates, who had traded her like a breeding animal, and who was probably at this moment experiencing the consequences of having done so. She thought about Frederick Ford, who had asked her what she wanted and who had listened when she told him, and who had laughed at the word conquest and who had read Middlemark twice. "Tell him I'm not here," she said. Frederick looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Amos. "Tell the writer you haven't seen anyone." Amos nodded and went. The night was very quiet after that. They sat on the porch without talking for a while, listening to the desert settle into darkness around them, the distant call of an owl from the direction of the cottonwoods, the low sound of cattle in the pasture. "This can't go on indefinitely," Frederick said finally. "Not an accusation, just a fact." "I know," she said. "The wedding was supposed to be tomorrow." "I know." He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, carefully, choosing his words the way he always chose his words, "Catherine, I want to say something to you, and I want you to understand that I'm saying it without any pressure attached. You can say whatever you like in response, and I won't take offense, and you're welcome to stay here as long as you need regardless." She turned to look at him. His profile was clean against the last pale light in the west, strong-jawed and serious. "Go ahead," she said. He turned and looked at her. "I think you're one of the most remarkable women I've ever met," he said. "And I've spent 4 days trying to talk myself out of that assessment because the timing is about as complicated as it gets, and I'm aware that you didn't come here because you were looking for a man to fix your situation. You came here because you needed somewhere to land. I respect that. I don't want to be another person making decisions about your life for you." She was very still. "But," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice now, something careful and honest and a little bit afraid, "I would like to know, when you decide what you want, whatever that is, wherever that leads, whether there's any chance at all that it leads in this direction." She looked at him for a long time. The owl called again from the cottonwoods. The stars were coming out, thick and bright in the Arizona dark. "I don't know," she said, "but the fact that I don't know isn't a no." Something in his shoulders relaxed very slightly, as though he had been holding a tension he had not entirely acknowledged. "That's enough for now," he said quietly. On the morning of the 4th day, Frederick Ford saddled Conquest and rode to the Harlan ranch himself. He went alone, over Catherine's objections, and he went because he said that a man with nothing to apologize for could ride up to someone's gate and have a conversation, and that the situation needed to be addressed directly rather than allowed to fester further. He told her to stay, and she had considered arguing about this at length, and had ultimately decided that this was one instance where his judgment was probably better than her instinct, because her instinct in the current moment wanted to ride to her father's ranch and say a number of things to Earl Yates that would not improve anything. He was gone for 5 hours. She spent those 5 hours in a state of anxious activity. She cleaned the kitchen. She mended 3 of Frederick's shirts. She checked Pearl's hooves and brushed her out thoroughly. She reorganized the shelves in the pantry according to a logic that made more sense to her than the current arrangement. And she sat on the porch for approximately 45 minutes watching the Northwest Road and trying not to. He came back at midday, riding Conquest at an easy trot, hat pushed back on his head, looking no worse for the experience. She was on the porch when he arrived, and she walked down to meet him before she had decided to, and he saw her coming and swung down from Conquest, and they stood in the yard and looked at each other. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, "it's complicated, but it's less complicated than it was." He told her what had happened. He had gone to the Harlan ranch and asked to speak with Silas Harlan. Silas had come out to the gate in no particularly welcoming mood, but he had come out because Frederick Ford was a neighbor with a decent reputation and no stake in the Harlan-Yates dispute, and Silas was, beneath the temper, a practical man. Wade had been there too, returned from Bisbee with Doyle Pratt, who was apparently already trying to restitch the peace agreement. Frederick had been direct. He had told Silas that Catherine was at his ranch, that she had come of her own accord, and that she was safe. He had said carefully that he thought the arrangement that had been made for her was the kind that did not sit well with a woman of her character, and that forcing the matter was not likely to result in the sort of marriage that was good for anyone. Silas Harlan had been angry. Frederick had expected this and had not flinched from it. And then Wade Harlan had said something that surprised them both. He had said that he agreed. He had said, specifically, that he had gone along with his father's plan because he had not thought through what it meant for the woman involved, and that in 3 weeks of living in the same house as Catherine Yates, he had come to understand that she was not a woman who would ever be content in a marriage she had not chosen, and that a marriage built on a land agreement rather than any particular feeling was not likely to make either of them happy. Silas had turned to his son with the expression of a man who has been contradicted by the one person he least expects contradictions from, and Wade had held his ground. He held his ground, Catherine said quietly. He held his ground, Frederick confirmed. I respected it. She thought about Wade eating his beans with his eyes on his plate. She thought about I'll talk to my father. She thought about the complicated expression she had not been able to read across the dinner table, and she understood now what it had been. It had been a man working up to something. It had just taken the crisis of her leaving to make him finish working up to it. What about the water rights, she asked. The debt. Frederick looked at her steadily. Silas will honor the water rights agreement regardless. Doyle Pratt is working it out. Your father's debt, the Harlans are withdrawing the offer to handle it. She absorbed this. Earl Yates was going to have to deal with his own mess. That's fair, she said. She had never expected anyone to clean up after her father indefinitely. The problem was that Earl Yates himself expected it. There's one more thing, Frederick said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded paper. He held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it. It was a short letter, written in a formal hand, with a salutation she recognized as Doyle Pratt's style. It stated, in the careful legal language of a man who handled disputes professionally, that the agreement between the Yates family and the Harlan family concerning the provision of a marriage between Catherine Yates and Wade Harlan was hereby dissolved by mutual consent of both parties, and that no claim was made by either family arising from this dissolution. She read it 3 times. She looked up at Frederick Ford. Silas signed it, she asked. Wade asked him to, Frederick said. And Silas, I think, has more respect for his son than he's let on. He signed it. She folded the paper carefully and held it in both hands and stood very still in the yard of the Ford ranch in the Dragoon foothills on a bright October morning in 1882, and she felt the weight she had been carrying for 3 weeks lift from her shoulders like a hat she had not known she was wearing. Then Frederick Ford said, "Pick which direction you want to ride." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with those attentive eyes, and his voice was even and honest, and there was nothing in it except the offer of a genuine choice, which was, she thought, the most valuable thing anyone had given her in a very long time. "What?" she said. "Any direction," he said. "You're free. You can ride to your father's ranch. You can ride to Bisbee and find work there, plenty of women do. You can ride north to Tucson or east to New Mexico. You can do whatever you like. That paper means nobody has a claim on you. Nobody except you." He paused. "I just want you to know that the door here is open, but I don't want you to stay because you don't have anywhere else to go. I want, if you stay, for it to be because you want to be here." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Earl Yates and the debts and the way he had looked at the floor that night. She thought about Bisbee and Tucson and New Mexico, real places, real possibilities for a woman with energy and stubbornness, and the ability to work hard. She thought about Pearl and the open road and the freedom of it. And she thought about sitting on this porch in the evenings watching the desert go dark, and the way he talked about the sunrise over the Dragoons, and a man who had read Middlemarch twice, and the simplest, most honest proposal she had ever received. "Pick which direction you want to ride." "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I don't have anywhere else to go. I want to stay because I want to stay here." He looked at her and she looked at him, and something settled between them, quiet and sure, the way water settles after a stone has been thrown in. He stepped forward, not hurrying, not presuming, just closing the distance between them to something honest, and he said, "Then I'm glad." He took her hand, both of them standing in the yard in the October sun, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was the best silence she had ever been part of. The weeks that followed were a kind of revelation. Catherine had never, in her 22 years, had the experience of being in a place because she had chosen to be there. The Yates ranch had been where she was born. The Harlan ranch had been where she was sent. The Ford place was where she had ridden of her own free will on the strength of an instinct and 4 words, and every morning when she woke in the spare room and heard the ranch coming to life outside, the cattle lowing, Amos's boots on the bunkhouse step, Conquest's restless movement in the barn, she felt the specific satisfaction of that choice. She and Frederick were careful with each other, in the beginning. Careful in the way of people who are aware that something important is growing between them, and do not want to rush it or damage it through carelessness. He treated her with a consistency of respect that was, she realized, what respect was actually supposed to feel like, not the performed respect of a man going through social motions, but the real thing, rooted in genuine regard for her as a person with thoughts and opinions and rights. She helped with the ranch, and he did not condescend about it. When she had ideas about how things might be organized, the kitchen stores, the rotation of the pastures, the scheduling of supply runs to Bisbee, he listened, and often as not he said that made sense and implemented them. When she had opinions about things, he engaged with those opinions. They argued sometimes about nothing in particular, the best route to a watering hole, the right seasoning for a stew, whether the autumn rains were coming early or late, and she found that she loved arguing with him because he argued fairly, which was a thing she had never experienced in her father's house. She also found that she loved making him laugh, which happened more than she expected. He had a laugh that started slow and then arrived fully, warm and surprised, as though he had not quite expected to be amused and was pleased about it. She wrote a letter to her father. It took her 3 drafts, because the first draft contained things she would not send, and the second draft was too cold, and the third draft was honest without being cruel. She told Earl Yates that she was well, that she was staying at the Ford ranch as a guest, and that she hoped he would find a way to handle his financial situation. She did not apologize for leaving, because she was not sorry. She told him that if he wanted to reach her, she was 20 miles northeast of the Harlan spread. She sealed the letter and gave it to Amos on his next run to Bisbee, and did not spend too long thinking about what the response would be. The response, when it came, was 2 lines in her father's crabbed handwriting. I suppose you've done what you've done. I'm told the debt is being renegotiated with different terms. Let me know you're safe when you can. It was not much. It was, for Earl Yates, as close to an acknowledgment of wrongdoing as he was capable of producing, and she understood him well enough to know that and to take it for what it was worth. She wrote back, I'm safe. I'll write again soon. And she did. Slowly, over months, the correspondence between them settled into something that was less than warm and more than nothing. The kind of careful maintenance of a relationship that had been damaged too fundamentally for easy repair, but that neither party was quite willing to abandon entirely. He was her father. That fact did not become simple just because it was complicated, and she had learned over 22 years not to expect simplicity from things that were not. November came, and with it the first cold nights, the desert wrapping itself in something almost gentle after the intensity of the summer. The cattle were fat and the autumn grass was still holding. Frederick rode out with Amos and Burl to move the herd to the winter pasture, and Catherine rode with them, because she was a capable horsewoman and there was work to be done, and nobody suggested she should stay behind. They were 3 days out on that drive, camping under a sky full of stars, and on the second night she and Frederick sat by the fire after Amos and Burl had rolled into their blankets, and they talked until the fire burned low, and it was on that second night that he kissed her for the first time. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not the kind of thing from the dime novels she had read, full of declarations and breathlessness. He had been in the middle of something he was saying about the Dragoon Mountains in winter, and she had turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and the conversation had simply stopped, And then he had reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that caught her entirely off guard. And then he had kissed her once, quietly. She kissed him back. When they pulled apart, he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and a little unguarded, the attentive eyes gone soft. "I've been wanting to do that," he said, "since approximately the second morning you reorganized my pantry." She laughed, which was not the response most women would probably produce in that particular moment, but it was an honest one, and he laughed too, and they sat by the dying fire together with his shoulder against hers and her hand in his and the Arizona stars burning above them, and it was one of the finest nights of her life. By December, it was understood between them and between Amos and Burl, who observed everything with the quiet satisfaction of men who had watched their employer be lonely for 4 years, that this was a serious thing. Frederick had asked her formally, on a Sunday afternoon when they were walking the north pasture fence line, whether she would consider marrying him. He had done it without theater, looking at her steadily, his hat in his hands. She had said yes before he finished the sentence. He had put the hat back on and taken her hands and said, very quietly, "I want you to know that this place is yours as much as it's mine. Your name on the deed, your voice equal in every decision. I mean that. Not just now when it's easy to say. I mean it as a principle." She looked at him and felt something she did not have a word for, some compound of gratitude and respect and love that was still new enough to be slightly frightening in its intensity. "I know you mean it," she said. "How do you know?" "Because you said it when I didn't ask for it," she said. "That's how you know when people mean things." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled, and she had become, by this point, thoroughly undone by his smile, though she maintained the dignity of not showing it excessively. They were married in January of 1883 in Bisbee, by the same Reverend Caulfield who had been supposed to marry her to Wade Harlan 3 months prior. The Reverend, who was a practical man, made no comment on this. Rosa from the Harlan ranch came, because Catherine had liked her and Rosa had asked if she could come, and Catherine had said of course. Amos and Burl were there, scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good shirts, which they wore with the expression of men undergoing a minor ordeal for someone they cared about. Frederick's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Tom Dillard who ran a spread 12 miles west and had become something of a friend, was there with his wife. Earl Yates did not come. Catherine had not expected him to, and had found, when she sat with the expectation and turned it over, that she was not as wounded by it as she might have been. She was not marrying her father. She was marrying Frederick Ford, and that was the thing she focused on as she stood next to him in front of Reverend Caulfield in her blue dress. She had been right about the blue, and said the words that she said with full and genuine conviction. Wade Harlan sent a letter, which she received a week after the wedding. It was brief and formal, but there was a line in it that she appreciated. "I hope you have found the life you chose, and I hope it suits you well." She thought about Wade more kindly than she might have expected, given everything. He had held his ground with his father. That was not nothing. The first year of marriage was a good one. Not a perfect one. There was no such thing, but a genuinely good one, with the texture and substance of real life rather than the flat ease of a story. There were disagreements, because they were both strong-willed people, and a strong-willed woman married to a strong-willed man was going to produce friction from time to time. But Frederick kept his word about her voice being equal in decisions, and she kept her own word about trusting him with the things he knew better than she did, and what they built between those two principles was a partnership that was solid in a way she had not known partnerships could be. The ranch grew. A good contract with the Army out of Fort Huachuca brought steady income, and Frederick's careful management of the herd meant they were expanding rather than merely maintaining. Catherine took over the accounting, which she was better at than he was. She had a head for numbers, a talent she had inherited from her mother and spent her childhood applying to things that didn't matter much. Applied to something real, it mattered considerably. She caught two errors in their supply agreements that were costing them money and renegotiated both. And the quiet pride she felt in that small victory was out of proportion to its size, and she did not care. She started a garden, which grew improbably well in the Dragoon foothills with enough water and stubbornness. She grew tomatoes and beans and squash, and a sprawling patch of kitchen herbs. She wrote regularly to a woman she had met through Tom Dillard's wife, a woman named Margaret who ran a small school in Bisbee, practical and educated, with opinions about everything and a willingness to correspond at length. And this correspondence became one of the genuine pleasures of her life, a thread of intellectual engagement she had been missing since her mother's death. Spring brought the announcement that she had half expected and been quietly hoping for. She told Frederick one morning at breakfast very simply, and watched his face go through a sequence of emotions: surprise, wonder, something unguarded and enormous, before settling into the most completely happy expression she had ever seen on anyone. He came around the table and took both her hands and held them and looked at her and didn't say anything for a long moment. "A baby," he said finally. "A baby," she confirmed. "Catherine," he said, with a reverence in his voice that made her eyes sting, which she blamed on the morning light and did not admit to. The pregnancy was not easy, exactly. She was too honest with herself for that soft version of it. The summer heat was punishing, and she was tired in a way that sat in her bones, and there were weeks in the middle months when the ranch work felt like wading through deep water. But she had a stubbornness that served her well, and she had Frederick, who was quietly, consistently attentive without being suffocating, who brought her water without being asked and noticed when she was tired, and said nothing that began with "Are you sure you should be doing that?" which she had half expected and had been prepared to have strong opinions about. She also had Rosa, who had left the Harlan employ earlier that spring. Silas had scaled back the household staff after some financial restructuring, and who Catherine had promptly invited to the Ford ranch. Rosa was a formidable cook and an equally formidable presence, and she and Catherine had developed something that was not quite friendship and not quite family, and was perhaps better than either. On a clear October night, exactly 1 year and 1 month after Catherine had ridden 20 miles across the Arizona desert in the direction of what she needed, she gave birth to their first child, a boy. He came into the world at something past midnight, by lamplight, with Rosa attending and Frederick just outside the door because Catherine had told him firmly that he did not need to be in the room, and he had accepted this with slightly more difficulty than he accepted most things she told him. She could hear him in the hall, not pacing. He was not a pacer, but very still in the particular way of a man who is genuinely frightened and is being very careful not to show it. When she called him in, he came to her bedside and sat on the edge and looked at the small red face of their son with an expression that she had no words for and did not need any. "He looks like you," she said, because he did the same strong jaw, the same attentive quality in the eyes, which were still the unfocused dark of a newborn but had something already. "He looks like his mother," Frederick said, which was also probably true and which she filed away to examine later when she was less exhausted. They named him James after Frederick's father. James Ford was a healthy and thoroughly opinionated infant, a fact that surprised no one who had met either of his parents. He had his mother's stubbornness and his father's stillness in turns, and he was the complete destruction of Catherine's sleep for the better part of 4 months, and she loved him with a ferocity that was slightly alarming in its intensity. The second year of their marriage brought them fully into what Catherine had come to think of as the real life, not the provisional or the temporary or the arrangement, but the actual life they were building, day by day, in the Dragoon foothills in a country that was as beautiful as it was hard. Amos, who had a daughter in Tucson, went to visit her in the spring of 1884 and came back with the news that he intended to retire there. He was 63, had worked cattle for 40 years, and his knees were finished with both the saddle and the cold mornings. Frederick shook his hand and gave him a month's wages as a gift, and told him he was welcome back any time. Amos looked at Catherine and James and the ranch and said, with the economy of a man who did not use two words when one would do, "You've made something good here." "We have," Catherine agreed. Burl stayed on and they hired a younger hand, a man named Henry who was 25 and from New Mexico and who had come to Arizona following the cattle contracts. He was competent and decent and had the quality of minding his own business, which Catherine appreciated. The situation with the Harlan family had settled into a neutral but functional relationship. The water rights were documented and honored. The Harlan cattle and the Ford cattle did not share pasture, which was the ideal arrangement. Silas Harlan, Catherine heard through various channels, had mellowed somewhat since the year of the dispute. His doctor in Bisbee had told him that his temper was going to kill him before the desert did, and this had apparently made an impression. Wade Harlan had eventually married a woman from Tucson, a minister's daughter, and by all accounts the marriage had been made of genuine feeling rather than negotiated obligation. Catherine was glad for that. She was genuinely glad. Earl Yates resolved his debt situation through a combination of selling off the South pasture acreage and an agreement with a land developer out of Phoenix who wanted the grazing rights. It was not the outcome Earl Yates would have chosen, but it was an outcome, and it meant he was no longer being visited by unpleasant men from Tucson. He was older now, and quieter in the way that time sometimes made difficult men quieter. He visited the Ford ranch once, in the autumn of 1884, riding out on a Wednesday afternoon without announcement, which was very like him. Catherine saw him coming from the window and stood at the door as he dismounted, and they looked at each other across the porch. He looked older than she remembered. Of course he did. It had been 2 years, and the 2 years before that had been unkind to him. He held his hat in his hands, which was a thing she recognized. "Catherine," he said. "Papa," she said, which was not a word she had been sure she would ever say to him again, and the fact that she said it naturally surprised her. He looked at the ranch, at the solid, well-kept house, the full pastures, the vegetable garden that Rosa kept growing even into October. He looked at Frederick, who had come out of the barn and was walking over unhurried. "This is your husband," Earl Yates said, less a question than a statement. "This is Frederick," she said. Frederick extended his hand and Earl Yates shook it, and there was a long moment where the two men assessed each other with the straightforward economy of men who did not particularly go in for pretense. Then Earl Yates said, "You treating her right?" "I am," Frederick said simply. Earl Yates looked at his daughter for another moment. There was something in his face that was complicated and old and not easy to name, something that might have been regret, or as close to it as he was capable of, which was not the same thing as regret but was perhaps what Earl Yates' version of it looked like. "Good," he said. They had dinner together, Rose's pot roast and the last of the fall tomatoes, and James on a blanket on the floor making the serious-faced investigations of an infant encountering the world. And it was not a warm evening in any theatrical sense, but it was a human one. Earl Yates held his grandson with the careful awkwardness of a man unaccustomed to infants, and James regarded his grandfather with the solemn curiosity he brought to most things, and Catherine watched from across the table and felt something settle in her that she had not been sure would ever settle. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was something more pragmatic, an acknowledgement that her father was a flawed man who had made choices she would never entirely excuse, that those choices had shaped her life in ways that were irreversible, and that the life they had shaped had brought her here, to this table in this house, in the Dragoon foothills, with this man and this child and this evening, and that this evening was genuinely good. That seemed like enough. Earl Yates rode back to his ranch that night, and she stood on the porch and watched him go, and Frederick stood beside her with his hand warm at the small of her back and James asleep in the crook of his arm, and she leaned into Frederick's side and said nothing, and he said nothing, and the October night was cold and clear and full of stars. The years after that were the years of a life fully lived, and if they were sometimes less dramatic than the year they had met, they were the better kind of life for it. James grew into a boy with his father's build and his mother's tongue, which was a combination that kept both of his parents entertained and occasionally exhausted. By the time he was 3, he was following Frederick around the pastures with the seriousness of a very small man who had important business to conduct. And by the time he was 4, he had opinions about the quality of the cattle that were surprisingly discerning. Catherine continued to manage the ranch's accounts and expanded this into something broader. She became known in the county as a woman who understood money and land contracts, and other ranching families, the smaller ones who couldn't afford a professional accountant, began coming to her. She charged a modest fee and she was meticulous and fair, and this brought in a small but consistent income that was, more importantly, hers, a thing she had built from her own expertise, for which she was directly responsible. She corresponded with Margaret in Bisbee about the school, and eventually she contributed to it books from a mail-order catalog out of St. Louis, and occasional days spent in town helping with the older children, who needed someone to talk to them about reading with some genuine enthusiasm. These were good days. She came home from them feeling filled up in a way that was different from, but complementary to, the fullness of the ranch and the family. Frederick watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had told a woman to pick her direction, and had been given the gift of watching her discover what direction she actually wanted. He was proud of her in a way that did not need to be announced. It was in the way he talked about her to other people, naturally and without diminishment, the way he told Tom Dillard that his wife had caught the error in their land survey and saved them a considerable legal headache, the way he looked at her from across a room. She noticed. She had always been a noticer. On a spring evening in 1885, they sat on the porch as they had sat on countless evenings, watching the last light leave the dragoons. James was asleep inside, exhausted from a full day of being 4 years old and extremely busy. Rosa was visiting her sister in Bisbee for the week. Burl and Henry were in the bunkhouse. The ranch was quiet and full of itself. She had something to tell him. She had known for about 2 weeks and had been waiting for the right moment, which she had decided was a loose concept, and perhaps this evening was as right as any. "I have news," she said. He looked at her with the attentive eyes, and she watched him parse her expression and arrive at the answer before she said it. "Another baby," she said. He was quiet for a moment, that particular quiet of a man absorbing something wonderful. Then he turned to face her fully, and he took both her hands in his large, warm, weathered hands, and he said, "Catherine, my God," she laughed. "Is that a good response?" "That is the best possible response," he said with conviction. "What other response is there?" He kissed her then, there on the porch in the spring evening with the Dragoon Mountains going dark and the desert settling into its nighttime quiet, and she kissed him back with 3 years of marriage and the particular sweetness of a life chosen rather than assigned, and when they pulled apart they were both laughing slightly, for no reason except that happiness sometimes needed to come out as laughter. "A girl this time," he said. "I have a feeling." "You are not equipped to have feelings about this," she told him. He grinned. Nevertheless, he was right. The following autumn, on another clear October night, October seemed to be their month, the month the significant things happened, their daughter arrived. She was smaller than James had been and louder, which Catherine had not expected to be possible but which turned out to be very true. She had a full head of dark hair and an opinion about her situation that she made clear from the first breath. They named her Eleanor, after Catherine's mother. Eleanor Yates Ford, who was named for a woman who had been warm and practical and had very little luck, grew up in a house full of books and horses and conversation, in the Dragoon foothills of Arizona Territory, and if her grandmother's lack of luck had settled anywhere, it did not settle on her. James, presented with his sister, regarded her for a long moment with the seriousness he brought to most situations, and then announced that she would need to learn to ride, which Catherine considered a reasonable orientation. The ranch, by the time Eleanor was a year old, had grown to just over 300 head of cattle and had expanded to include a proper apple orchard on the north slope. An optimistic project that Frederick had started the year James was born, and which was only now beginning to produce in earnest, small and tart and startling in the middle of the desert. Catherine had planted rose bushes along the porch railing, because she had always wanted rose bushes, and there was no longer anyone to tell her what she could or could not plant, and they grew with the same stubborn vitality as everything else in that particular piece of ground. Earl Yates died in the spring of 1887, peacefully, in his sleep, which was more peaceful than most of his life had been. Catherine went to the ranch for the burial and stood by the grave in the morning light and said goodbye to a complicated man who had been, in his way, responsible for everything that had come after good and bad, and all the things in between. She thought, standing there, about the morning they had traded her, about the riders coming up the long road in the peach and gold of early morning, about the saddlebag she had packed and the decision she had not consciously made, and the 20 miles northeast. She thought about a man on a porch saying, "Pick which direction you want to ride." She thought about blue fabric and conquest and campfires under Arizona stars, and a folded paper that had set her free, and a hand extended across a table, and the way a life becomes itself one choice at a time, even the choices you make in a panic, even the choices made for you by other people that you find a way to unmake. She held Frederick's hand through the service, and James stood solemnly beside his father, very tall for 5 years old, and Eleanor was with Rosa, back at the Ford ranch, too young for funerals. On the ride home, with James asleep against Frederick's shoulder in the wagon and the desert going golden in the afternoon light, she felt fully, completely, without qualification, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because anyone had decided that for her, because she had decided it for herself. She leaned her head against Frederick's shoulder, and he turned and pressed his lips to her hair, briefly, the small private tenderness of a long marriage. And she looked out at the desert stretching away on either side of the road, the Dragoon Mountains ahead of them in the east, familiar and permanent in hers. "I want to add another room to the house," she said after a while. "I know," he said. "You know. You've been measuring with your eyes for 2 months," he said. "I figured you were working up to saying it." She laughed. She was always laughing in this life. "An office," she said. "A proper one for the accounts." "With a window that faces the mountains," he said, as though he had been thinking about it too, which he probably had. "With a window that faces the mountains," she agreed. James stirred against Frederick's shoulder, opened one eye, and said, with the particular authority of a 5-year-old who has just woken up, "And a room for a horse." "Horses do not live in the house," Catherine told him. "Eleanor's room is also a horse room," James announced, with complete conviction, and promptly went back to sleep. Catherine and Frederick looked at each other over his sleeping head, and she felt, looking at Frederick Ford's face in the late afternoon light of an Arizona Territory road in 1887, the full specific weight of what it meant to have a life that was genuinely yours, not assigned, not traded, not arranged, but built piece by piece from the choices you made and the people you chose and the 20 miles you rode towards something you could only feel and not yet see. She looked at the Dragoon Mountains ahead of them, and she thought, yes, this is the direction she had picked, and it was right. The room went up that summer, an addition to the north side of the main house with 3 windows, one of which did face the mountains as specified. Catherine's desk, a proper one, ordered from the catalog, with real drawers and a wide surface, went under that window, and the shelves she filled with the ranch's ledgers and the neighbors' account books and her mother's copy of Middlemark, which she had rescued from the Yates ranch before it was sold off. Frederick built her a bookshelf beside the desk, which she filled immediately and then required a second, which he built without being asked. This became something of a pattern in the years that followed. She would need a thing, and he would have already been thinking about how to build it, and they would discover this overlap and be unreasonably pleased by it. The Ford Ranch became a fixture of Cochise County over the next several years. Not the biggest operation, not the most powerful family, but known for good cattle and fair dealing, and a woman who managed the accounts better than anyone in the region, and a man who kept his word, and a pair of children who were being raised with the understanding that the world could be engaged on one's own terms if you had the courage and the intelligence to do it. Tom Dillard's wife, Agnes, and Catherine became genuine friends, the kind of friendship between women that is built on honest conversation and mutual respect for each other's intelligence, the kind that survives disagreements and busy seasons, and the long stretches where life is too full for visiting. Agnes had opinions about everything and was unafraid to share them, and Catherine loved her for it. Eleanor, as she grew, showed all the signs of being her mother's daughter. She had opinions. She was physically fearless. She could ride before she was 4 and she could read before she was 5, and she argued with James with the focused intensity of a much older child. James received all of this with the long-suffering patience of a firstborn being improved upon by a younger sibling, which is to say not always patiently, but with a fundamental affection that was obvious to everyone who watched them. In the evenings, the family gathered on the porch that Catherine had lined with rose bushes, and the view of the Dragoon Mountains was the same view it had been when she arrived on a fading October afternoon riding a pale roan mare with 20 miles of desert behind her, and a folded paper, and a choice, and a man who had looked at her, and said simply, "Come in." She thought, sometimes, about the way life had seemed, in those weeks before she had ridden out like a thing happening to her, like a piece being moved on a board. And she thought about how completely that had changed, in the span of 4 days and one clear-headed decision, and one man's straightforward honesty. And she was grateful in a way that was quiet and constant, and did not need to be stated. On the night of their 5th wedding anniversary, Frederick took her out to the east pasture at dusk, and they sat on the fence rail and watched the sky change over the mountains in the color that he had never quite been able to name, not red, not orange, something in between, the color that had made him stay. "Do you remember," he said, "that first morning you reorganized the pantry?" "I reorganized it because it needed reorganizing," she said. "It did," he agreed. "And I sat at the kitchen table and watched you move around the kitchen like you had already decided it was yours, and I thought, well, that's the end of that." She looked at him. "The end of what?" "Of any future that didn't include you," he said simply, the way he said the most important things without theater or ceremony, just honest and clean. She looked at him for a long moment in the color that had no name, and she thought about 20 miles across the desert and pick which direction you want to ride and what it meant to be someone who chose. She reached over and took his hand. "It was a very well-organized pantry," she said. He laughed that slow, arriving laugh, and she laughed with him. There on the fence rail with the Arizona sky going dark above them and the mountains in the east, and the rose bushes on the porch behind them, and the children asleep in the house, and the life they had built spread out in every direction around them. Solid and real and full, exactly the life she had chosen. On that October morning when she had packed one saddlebag and ridden toward what she needed and found, 20 miles northeast. The direction she had wanted all along.